Welcome back, and we're now finally ready to start writing some code. And we'll be starting by learning how to send a message to a queue. Before we start this lesson, make sure you have your WildFly application server up and running, and as a reminder, you'll want to run the standalone.sh file if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine, or the standalone.bat file if you're on a PC, but make sure you start it with the server configuration option to ensure that the full config file that we edited in the last chapter is used. You can check it's up and running by visiting the page on the localhost console under configuration and then subsystems, and checking that you've got messaging ActiveMQ as an option here. Okay, so we're now ready to start. Now, although JMS has been long recognized as a really well-designed and very usable library, it is very verbose. The enormous amount of code you can see on screen here is what we need for the actually simple task of sending a message to a queue on WildFly. Now, don't start copying this code in, as it won't actually work just yet. I've simplified it slightly just to get it to fit on a single caption. I think what I'm going to do to describe what's happening in this code is to start right here on these 3 lines of code, because this is really the heart of the process. First, I'm creating here an instance of the class TextMessage. Now, this object comes from the JMS API. You'll find most of the classes that we're using here come from JMS. Now, I have to create this text message object in a special way using this helper object called session, and I'll describe that in a minute. But I hope you can see, using your regular Java skills, that the process is quite simple. I create a text message and I set the text of that message in the constructor. And then I'm calling a method from JMS called send on this other object of a type message producer, and that allows me to send the message to a queue. So that's the sending process, which is quite simple. The problem is, as you can see, there's a lot more code that we have to go through. There's quite a lot of ceremony to actually be able to send a message. So let's start from the top. The first 2 objects that we need are the queue object and the connection factory object. I'll come on to what these objects do in just a few moments, but the first thing to notice is that we aren't instantiating these objects in our code. In fact, we're using JNDI to look up these objects. So that means that these 2 objects, the queue and the connection factory, will have been configured administratively on the WildFly server. So this is exactly the same process as we've done earlier on the course, such as when we were configuring connection pools. If you've got any doubts about what's going on here, have a look back on the earlier chapters of Module 1, where we understood how to use JNDI. It's a bit awkward that we have to look up 2 separate objects. So let's look at what these are. The first of them is the queue object. This is an object defined in JMS, and it represents the actual physical queue that eventually we're going to be sending our messages to. We're going to need to configure this queue on WildFly, and we'll be doing that very soon. And as you'll see, when we configure that queue, we have to give it a JNDI name. And that's the name that we'll be referencing here. I've just put in the phrase queue name, but really this would be the full JNDI lookup string. That can be any lookup string we like to give it. We can call it anything we like. But that's how our code knows which queue to send the message to. The connection factory is a little bit more complicated. We're going to be using a physical network connection to talk to our queue. And the connection factory, again, is an object that we're going to be looking up using JNDI. It's an object in the WildFly console which will give us access to the connection that we're using to talk to the queue. And in fact, the default queue configuration that comes with WildFly, and that's what we're using, is going to be a standard TCP IP connection. The idea of giving us access to this object is that we could do things such as securing the queue and making it so that we have to provide logon credentials. In any case, it's the connection object that will allow us to get a physical, hard connection to the connection pool. Now you might think, as I did when I first started using JMS, now that we have a queue object, we can start sending messages to it. Well, as you can see, there's a little more to it than that. Another 2 lines of code still to go. The first thing we need to do is we need to create an object of type session. Now, the full details of what this session is doing and what it's responsible for, I'm going to explain in more detail as we go further through the course. But this object has responsibilities for things like managing transactions on the message queue. We don't need to understand that in detail just yet, but it is absolutely required. So I'm going to create this session object by calling a method on the connection object called createSession. And as you can see, this requires 2 parameters, and I'm going to describe these parameters again later on in the course. The final step, once we've created this session, is to create a further object called the message producer. Now, this is the object that will be responsible for delivering the messages to the queue, and that's why I'm passing into its creation, the reference to the queue object that we've already created. That's an enormous amount of work, but it is kind of a copy and paste job because it's actually very routine, and we're going to follow this same pattern of code time after time. Now, that's not an excuse for not understanding what's happening here, though, so I do hope you have a reasonable grasp of what each line of code is doing. To review, we're accessing JNDI, which will give us access to the 2 objects configured in WildFly, the queue itself, and the factory for obtaining connections to the queue. We're then going to get a physical network connection to the queue, and we can create a session which will allow us to manage transactions on the queue. Then we create a message producer, which will actually allow us to talk to the queue, and then we can finally send the message to the queue. The final step you can see at the bottom of the screen here is to close the connection. Now you can rest assured that when you're closing connections, this will also close the session and our physical connection to the queue. So we don't have to worry about closing any of the other objects, but you must close the connection. Now, I'm not going to just copy and paste all of this code into Eclipse. We're going to have to think about where we need to close the connection, and we're going to have to think about exception handling as well. And when I said I simplified the code slightly to make it fit on the caption, well, that was what I was referring to. But I've talked far too long, and I hope you have a reasonable understanding of what's going on here. I think it's time to finally write this code in Eclipse and get this running. So here's my Eclipse workspace, and I've closed all of the projects that we've built in the other modules of this course. We're not actually going to use any of those projects in this module, so we're going to start with a brand new Java project. And we're going to call this project Bookstore POS. POS will stand for point of sale, and we'll click on Finish. Now, because we'll need to access some of the JavaEE libraries, such as the ability to do a JNDI lookup, and of course we'll need the queue and the message objects. They come from JMS, which of course we know is part of JavaEE. They're not part of standard Java. We'll need to add the JavaEE client libraries to our project. Remember, we're building a client application here. We're not building an EJB that we'll deploy to the server, so it's absolutely the client libraries that we need to add. So let's do that. I'm just going to expand my project, and we're going to choose build path and configure build path. And we want to go to our libraries tab, choose add external jars, and we then need to navigate to where we've installed WildFly on our system. So for me, that was in the OPT folder, then WildFly, and then you need to go to the bin folder, then client, and choose jboss-client.jar. If you've done the first module in this course, hopefully you'll remember this, and that gives us access to the JavaEE libraries for our client to use. And we're now ready to create a class in our project, and I think we'll call this class sendMessage. Now, I want to be able to run this class, so we'll tick the box for the public static void main method to be created. And we're now ready then to start to write some code. Now, we're going to put the code to send a message into this main method. And so in this main method, we're going to simulate the sale of a book. And when a book is sold, we want to be able to send a message to a queue on the server. So we're going to start with the JNDI lookup. I hope you'll remember this from Module 1. We need an object, first of all, of type properties. And I'm just going to import that object with Control and space. Obviously, it's Command and space if you're on a Mac. And it's this java.util properties that we need. We'll call this JNDI properties. And we'll set that equal to a new instance of the properties object. Okay, so to set the properties, we call the put method. And the first thing we need to do is to put a property which has the name context dot and then in capitals URL PKG prefixes. We can see that the IntelliSense is helping me out here. And we set that equal to, in quotes, org.jboss.ejb.client.naming. I think we went through what these are in the first module, but these are the things that WildFly requires us to supply to allow us to connect to WildFly and to use JNDI. The next one then is the key name is jboss.naming.client.ejb.context, and we set that value to true. We need to set the initial context factory, so that is going to be, just put in the put, and that is context dot, and then in capitals, once again, initial context factory. I've just used IntelliSense to complete that for me. And the value we need for this one is org.jboss.naming.remote.client. And then this final one is capital I for initial, capital C for context, and capital F for factory. Okay, I think that looks good. And the final of our properties, I know this is a bit tedious, is to provide the URL for our server. So that's going to be our JNDI properties.put. And we provide context dot, again in capitals, it's provide a URL. And that's going to be, in quotes, http-remoting, :2// the name of our server, which for us is localhost, : and the port number, which is 8080. Okay, so we're now ready then to create our context object, which we need to be able to do the JNDI lookups. So that's an object of type context, and I'll just import that and make sure you're picking the one from javax.naming. There are some alternatives here, but it's the top one that we need. We'll call this CTX, and I'm going to set that equal to a new, and you might remember we need to use this helper class called initial context, and we pass into the constructor the properties object that we've created, which is called JNDI properties. Okay, we'll need to import initial context. So again, make sure you pick the version from javax.naming. And we can see that's not going to compile. Yes, we can see that we need to handle the naming exception. So let's put this in a try-catch block. And well, I think for now, we'll just print out the exception. The print stack trace, I think, is just fine to print it to the console. That's absolutely what we need to do for the moment. So we've got our context object. We can now use that to do a JNDI lookup to get a reference to our queue. We haven't actually created the queue on the server. We'll be doing that quite soon, but let's pretend that we have, and we'll get a reference to it in our code. So we're trying to get an object of type queue. That's another of these JMS objects. Let's import it. And it comes from javax.jms. Make sure you pick this version, not the JavaUtil version. And we'll call it queue. And we want to set that equal to, well, we're doing a JNDI lookup. So it'll be CTX, our context object, dot lookup. And we need to provide in here the JNDI string for the queue. Now, we haven't created that yet, but we'll assume we're going to call it, in quotes, JMS / and then the name of our queue, which is going to be bookstore queue. We haven't really talked about how to name queues before, but by convention, we tend to prefix any queue names with this JMS/, and we need to remember this string because when we come to create the queue on the server, we'll need to make sure that it matches JMS/bookstore queue. Okay, well, we'll do that in a few minutes, but let's put the semicolon on the end of the line. And you might remember when you do a JNDI lookup, you have to cast the object that's returned to the required type. So we'll need to cast the object that's returned to of type Q. We'll put that in brackets here. And hopefully that line of code is now going to compile. That's looking good. So we've got the Q, but the other thing we also need to get is the connection factory. So that's an object of type connection factory. Once again, we'll import it, and it should be the version coming from JavaEx.jms. That looks good. We'll call this one CF for connection factory. And again, we're doing a JNDI lookup. So very similar to what we had before. We're going to cast the results to an object of type connection factory. And then we can do our ctx.lookup. Now, the connection factories are actually already configured for us in WildFly. There's a default that comes from the application server. We'll have a look at it when we go and configure the queue on the application server. But the JNDI string that we need here is JMS/remote connection factory. This is a case-sensitive string, so make sure you've got a capital for the R, the C, and the F in remote connection factory. Just put the semicolon at the end of that line. That looks like it'll compile. That's good. And now we can get finally the connection object. So that's going to be an object of type connection, which we'll call connection. And we set that equal to cf.createConnection. Now, connection needs to be imported. Once again, it's a JavaEx.jms object. There's a lot of connection objects here, so let's be careful to make sure we pick the right one. And we can see that cf.createConnection could throw a JMS exception. So I'm going to tell Eclipse to add a catch for this particular exception type to our catch clauses. If that happens, if there's a JMS exception, it can't get a connection to the server, well, clearly we're not going to be able to process this code. In a production standard application, you'd think about how to handle that. For now, I think all we can really do is print something out to the console. So that's fine. Okay, so we've got our connection object. We can use that to get an instance of the session object. Let's call it session, and we get that from calling connection.createSession. Now, there are a few different versions of Create Session. I am going to be talking about these later on, but for now, it's important that we use this version that takes 2 arguments. And again, I'm going to explain what these arguments are later on in the course. I think it's just too complicated to go through it now, so just follow along. We need to provide the first with a value of false, and the second is session dot, and then in capitals, auto acknowledged. This is an enum type that we need to provide, and that will create the session for us. I think we need to check that session has been imported correctly. Yes, it has. That's up there. That looks good. And then finally, we're able to create the message producer object, which is the object that has the send method that can send a message to the queue. So that's going to be an object of type message producer. And we'll call it message producer. And we get that by calling session.createProducer. And we need to provide a single parameter, which is our queue. Well, we created that up here. That's just the variable with the name queue. So an awful lot of work to get to this point, but we've now got our message producer, and we can call it send method and send a message to the queue. So that was very, very tedious. It was a lot of hard work, but from now on, we'll hopefully be able to do some copying and pasting if we want to put this in anywhere else. Let's just import message producer, of course, and make sure we pick the one from JavaEx.jms. Okay, so we can now call the send method on the message producer, but of course we need a message to send. And we're going to be creating an object of type text message. So let's put that in here. We'll call it message, and we create the object by calling a method on the session So that's going to be session.createTextMessage. There are a few different message types, and we are going to talk about those very soon, but a text message, as I hope you'll guess, is going to be a very simple string, and that's all we need to do. And let's make the message the words hello world. And just so that we know which message is which, in case we send lots of messages as we test this, I'm going to add on the date and time. So let's put in maybe a full stop after hello world, and then the time is now, and we'll add onto this a new instance of the date class. Okay, so that's going to create the message. Obviously, we'll need to import text message. And of course, we'll need to import date as well from Java util. So we've got a message, we've got a message producer, we can finally send the message. Actually, I'm sorry, I've just spotted here, I've misspelt the word message. There's too many S's there. Hopefully that looks like it's going to compile now. That's good. So finally, we're ready to send our message. So that's going to be message producer dot send, and then we pass in the instance of the message. So that's our code almost complete. The only thing we need to do is we do need to close our connection. Now, the problem we've got here is that we need to be very careful to make sure the connection is always closed, even if an exception occurs. So what I think we should probably do is put the call to close our connection in a finally block. So let's do that down here. After the catch blocks, we'll have a finally block. And what I want to do then in here is close the connection. Well, our connection was declared in our try block here. Where is it? It's here. So I think what we'll need to do is to move the declaration of this connection object outside the try block. So let's just do that. Before our try block, we'll put in a connection object, which we'll call connection. And I'll need to initialize it by setting it to null initially. Then we can set its value here. And then we can try and close it in the finally block. So that's going to be connection.close. Now, I guess if our connection wasn't open, then calling connection.close could throw an exception. And we can see here that we've got an unhandled exception of type JMS exception. So let's surround this with a try catch block. And actually, if we get an exception here, it simply means the connection wasn't open. So I think that's one we can safely ignore. I'm just going to leave our catch block empty. So that was quite a lot of work. It's some horrible looking code, but I think that will do what we need. That should be able to send a message to a queue. I'm just going to tidy it up by removing these to-do lines. And that's the code that we need. Now, you will find a copy of this code in the closing workspace for this chapter. So if you're having any problems typing this in, or if you want to save a bit of time and load it up from the final workspace, you can do so. But I hope that you've been following along with me and that you understand at least most of what's going on here. We are going to be revisiting this code a number of times as we go through the course. So if you're not completely sure what every single line is doing, don't worry, by the end of this course, you will be. Now, I'm going to run this code, although I actually don't expect it to work just yet because we're trying to send a message to a queue and we haven't yet created that queue on the server. But I'd like to run it just to make sure we don't get any unusual exceptions that we're not expecting. So let's do that here. And we've got some logging and right, we've got a name not found exception, and what's not been found is bookstore queue. So that's good. It's telling us that we have managed to connect to the server. We've tried to do a JNDI lookup, but there's no JNDI string of JMS bookstore queue on the server. So let's go and do that then. We need to go to the WildFly console and choose configuration and subsystems, then messaging ActiveMQ. And you need to click on this word default here and then choose queues and topics. We'll be talking about what a topic is a little bit later on. So these are the screens that we can use to configure any queues that we'd like to use and the connection factories. Let's start with connection factories. And I mentioned already for you that there is a default connection factory built in for us to use called JMS/remote connection factory. And here it is. This comes with the default configuration of WildFly. And you can see that the JNDI name is our Java JBoss/exported. So we know it's available to use from our remote client. Hopefully you'll remember from the first of our modules, when you do a JNDI lookup from a remote client, you can only look up objects that are in the Java JBoss exported section, and you don't include Java JBoss exported in the JNDI name that you provide on the client. You might see that there's another connection factory here. This one is called in-VM connection factory. In-VM means inside the virtual machine, or in other words, this is a connection factory that can be used on the server. It's actually the connection factory that will be used if we deploy an EJB to the server, and we will be doing that later on in the course, but right now we're working from a remote client, so it's definitely this second connection factory that we need to use. You can see here that there are some different settings that you can choose to edit. We're not going to cover that, that would be quite advanced, but it's good enough to know that this connection factory is here, so we're safe to call it from our code. Okay, so that looks good. Let's now go and create the new queue. So we'll click on this Queues and Topics option here, make sure the Queues tab is selected, and you can see that we've already got two queues that come by default in our system, called the expiry queue and the DL queue, and we are going to be talking about both of these later on in the course. But notice that the JNDI names don't include the Java JBoss exported part, so we can't call these queues from our remote client. But what we want to do is create a brand new queue, so we'll click on this Add button here, and we'll start by giving the queue a name, and this can be absolutely anything. It's the server's internal name for the queue, but I think it makes sense to call it Bookstore Queue. And then we need to provide the JNDI names. Well, we want this to be callable from our client, so we have to start the JNDI name with Java :JBoss /exported / and then whatever we're going to put on our client to call the queue. Well, hopefully you'll remember that is lowercase JMS, and I did say it's conventional to prefix any queue names with JMS / and then the name of our queue, which is Bookstore Queue. Now, there are, as you can see here, a couple of other options. I'm going to leave these. I'm going to leave the durable box ticked, and I'm going to ignore selector. We are going to have a look at what the durable option means later on. We're not going to cover selectors in this course. It's a very advanced feature of ActiveMQ that allows you to apply filters to messages. We're not covering that. I've actually never used one, but it is something that you can look up if you are going to do some very advanced work with JMS. But for now, that's all we need to do. So we'll click Save, and hopefully our queue will be created. Well, we can see it here in the list at the bottom there, so that's looking good. And I think that means we should be ready to go and run our code. Just before we do it, let's have a little look at the queue in the WildFly console. We'll come out of the configuration, and this time we'll go to Runtime, and then Standalone Server, of course, Subsystems, and ActiveMQ, and click on the View button. And we just need to click on this view next to the word Default as well. And here's our Bookstore queue. Now I've selected Bookstore queue to make sure it's highlighted, and you can see we get some metrics at the bottom of the screen here. It's very basic, but we'll find this useful to check that things are working. Right now we can see that there are no messages in the queue. No messages have ever been added. I would say let's remember these figures, but for now, of course, it's easy to remember 0. But we're going to now run our code and see if anything changes. So let's go back to Eclipse, and we'll once again run the code. Just come out of the console, back to our code window, and we'll click on the Run button again. Okay, so we've got some logging information here. I've not configured SLF for J, which is why we've got something that says it looks like an error, failed to load a class, but that's just to do with logging. I've actually not got any errors there to indicate that something's gone wrong with running the code. So let's go back to WildFly, and we'll refresh the results. There's a little button here to click on. And we can see that now one message has been added to the queue, and the current size of the queue is one message. So it looks like everything's worked. It looks like we've managed to send a message to the queue. Now, we can't unfortunately view the queue within the console. The only way to do that is to write some code to look at the queue, and we're going to do that in the next chapter. So I hope that that's made sense. We've done quite a lot of work in this chapter just to send a simple message to a queue, but most of the code that we've written is going to be code that you'll probably copy and paste if you're ever going to be writing client code that sends a message to a queue. The only important bit really was this line here, the one that creates the message. Everything else is pretty much going to be a boilerplate template that we'll be reusing a lot whenever we use client code. So we need to now go and read the message to check that it's worked, and we'll do that in the next chapter. I'll see you there.